Hi everyone, welcome to Historically Speaking, an online YouTube history channel focused on the history of various institutions and professionals, how history intersects with education, culture, and the world around us. I'm Karen Yang, your host. Today we have Professor Marci Shore, who teaches modern European intellectual history. She has done a lot of really great research on the intellectual history of the 20th and 21st century in Central and Eastern Europe. She is an American Associate Professor of Intellectual History at Yale University, where she specializes in the history of literary and political engagement with Marxism and phenomenology, right? Which is super cool. She's also the author of a lot of really interesting literature, including the author of Caviar and Ashes, a Warsaw Generation's Life and Death in Marxism, 1918 to 1968, which is a really great biography of Polish and Polish Jewish writers drawn to Marxism in the 20th century. And she's also just written a lot of really interesting literature, as I stated before, and I'll make sure to link a place where you can check that all out inside the link description box below.
Mm.
Thank you so much, Professor Shore, for joining us today. Is there anything else you'd like to add to your bio or something that I missed, I guess?
There is a link on my Yale webpage to all sorts of essays and articles that you can pull up online. So that's probably a better introduction than anything I could say.
Yeah,
See what topics look interesting and click on those.
yeah, let your work kind of speak for itself, I
Mm.
guess, which is super cool. Yeah, I want to just get started, I guess, with, I find it really fascinating that, you study like this idea of intellectual history,
Mhm.
which I think definitely is not introduced in like the K to 12 curriculum at
No.
all. Why do you feel like you've studied or like to study, or why do you think it's important that we look at intellectual history and at European history? And what do you feel like draws you personally to those fields, I guess?
Okay, that's a very good question. There's a lot of questions in there.
Yeah,
So
it's like
there's the question about intellectual history as a discipline, and there's a question about how I became, a Europeanist in general and an East Europeanist in particular. And those are to some extent two different stories. How I became a Slavicist, how I became interested in Eastern Europe, was because when I was your age, really probably exactly your age, the Berlin Wall fell. And it was the end of communism in Eastern Europe. And it was the drama of that moment that drew me to Eastern Europe. So in my case, it was very much a generational story. I was 17 in November 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell. I was the last generation raised during the Cold War. The world was divided by this Iron Curtain. Nobody was ever going to see what was on the other side of it. Perhaps there was going to be a nuclear war and we were all going to be blown up because there was this evil empire on the other side of it. And it was very dark and mysterious. And then one day it was just over, as if literally from one day to the next. And that was very seductive. I mean, the fact that a door that had been shut forever was suddenly opened. I wanted to go through that door just because it had been shut and was then opened, in the way that I think in some ways is typical of young people or of teenagers, that you want to see things. You want to get through those doors. You want to cross the threshold. You want to go to new places. And so when I first was hanging around Eastern Europe in the early and mid 1990s, it was really filled with a lot of Americans of exactly my generation who were also fascinated. Most of them eventually kind of got over it and went home and got a real life. And I didn't. I stayed and I learned languages and I became a historian. But that story is very much a generational story. And I can imagine that in somewhat different circumstances, it was very contingent. I mean, it was kind of chance that I was 17 when the Berlin Wall fell. I can imagine that I could have become a historian of many different parts of the world had there been some serendipitous dramatic connection at any kind of given moment, or had I had a chance to go somewhere for some reason or met somebody. Now, intellectual history as a discipline is related but separate, because intellectual history is not just the intellectual history of Europe. You could do the intellectual history of any place, of Latin America, of India, of Australia, of Taiwan. It's all possible. And what it is an interdisciplinary field.
Mm-hmm.
which is a kind of combination of history, political theory, literature, a lot of philosophy. I work on a lot of philosophy.
Ooh.
Um, and it exists kind of on the borders of those fields.
Mm-hmm.
And it's done very differently by different people. It's about the history of ideas. And some practitioners of intellectual history write a history of ideas or work on history of ideas really at the level of ideas, ideas talking to other ideas. The intellectual history I write tends to be more embodied. I
Mm-hmm.
tend to write a lot about specific concrete people and their relations to one another. And the ideas and philosophies kind of emerge through the lives of those people.
Mm-hmm.
But that it's not because that's the right way to do it and other ways are the wrong way to do it. There's just a very wide variety of angles you can take in intellectual history. And I was always interested in ideas. I was interested in philosophy. I was interested in aesthetics. I was interested in literature. And so intellectual history has allowed me to do that. Now, the other thing I really like about intellectual history is that it's not that writing the history of intellectuals or of philosophers, it's not that their lives were necessarily more interesting than the lives of peasants or the lives of ordinary workers or the lives of anybody else.
Mm-hmm.
Where it becomes very seductive is that intellectuals tend to produce a lot of material about themselves.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a writer, then you produce a lot of writing,
Yeah.
or you might be tempted to save your correspondence. You might be tempted even to save copies of the letters you wrote, even pre-internet. And so the richness of the source base
Mm-hmm.
is incredibly seductive because you can write about people with a level of granular detail that
Mm-hmm.
is very difficult to get to when you're trying to write about historical characters who were not doing all this writing. Because, right,
Yeah.
because we're dependent upon the sources.
Mm-hmm.
We're dependent on finding those sources. So there are fascinating lives,
Mm-hmm.
of illiterate peasants, but
Mm-hmm.
it's very hard to get access to
Mm-hmm.
that because our sources tend to be the kind that don't allow us the same degree of intimacy because those people aren't producing all this writing. I mean,
Yeah.
in my first book, I mean, one of the reasons some of the main characters got to be main characters were there were these, very, very self-absorbed poets who thought that everything they wrote was extremely important and the world moved on what they said to one another. And a couple of them, when the Second World War broke out and Nazi Germany attacked Poland, they actually buried their own archives. So they literally took like all of the letters that they had received for the past 20 years and put them in milk crates and buried them underground. And in some cases, those archives were recovered then after the war, even though Warsaw was burnt to the ground. So it
Wow.
was precisely that kind of arrogance and self-absorption and sense that, everything I wrote must be terribly important that allowed me to reconstruct their lives and relationships with that level of detail. And I love the detail. I love being able to write with that kind of specificity and with
Mm-hmm.
that kind of intimacy, and intellectual history has allowed me to do that precisely because people are sufficiently self-absorbed as to both produce lots of writing and save lots of writing.
Yeah. That's so cool. First of all, I kind of love how there's kind of this juxtaposition, or there's kind of like a certain level of irony in thinking that, oh, in order for me to understand, their life and where this person is coming from, they would have had to have thought of themselves as super important
Mm,
or important enough to like really document and like inscribe and be like, oh, I have my own archives. What do you mean?
mm,
Like, of course I have my own archives at home, which I think is super interesting. I also really think the idea of I think like a historian's job honestly is to like really tap into those sources and understand a person's
mm,
life so minutely in a way. And I do agree that,
mm,
I feel like we've lost so many people's lives to history because they haven't had that chance to write things down or
mm,
save things in their archives or something like that. I
mm.
think it's
And
interesting.
one of the things that's being done now much more widely are oral histories,
Hmm.
which can then be recorded, and digital technology has made it much easier to record.
Hmm.
So there's a fantastic archive. Example, two of my friends and colleagues, Dov Curler and Jeff Feidlinger, in the first decade or so of the 21st century, did hundreds of interviews and life stories with the last surviving Yiddish speakers, native Yiddish speakers, mostly in present-day Ukraine, Romania, Moldova, Poland, and Russia.
Mm-hmm.
And so many people who were not themselves writing, now we have a digital archive of their speaking about their lives. So
Mm-hmm.
the digitalization of archives and the fact that you can now do lots of oral history interviews and digitalize the archives and
Mm-hmm.
record people so easily, I think is going to open up the possibility, of writing with a level of detail about people that was previously difficult. Now, the problem is with memoir sources, because historians are very skeptical about memoir sources because retrospectively people tend to remember things inaccurately.
Yeah.
Not no source is perfect. There's
Mm-hmm.
no such thing as a perfectly objective source that is produced outside of time and space and human frailty. But historians tend to privilege sources that were written contemporaneously. So we would rather have a diary than a memoir.
Yeah.
We would rather have a correspondence, than a memoir, because we're trying
Yeah.
to get as close as we can.
Yeah. Honestly, I think that is so true because given, maybe like a week's perspective, a month's perspective, not to mention like 5 or 10 years, so many things that, you thought were like factual or definitely interpreted in one way with that span of time can definitely be interpreted in another way with all of this like additional information
Mhm.
and stuff like that. So I'm thinking like even when I write, I'm like, oh wow, like that's a great idea, but then
Mhm.
give me like 20 minutes, I'll be like, no, that's
Mhm.
not what I was thinking about. So I think that is super cool. I wanted to ask, I think you briefly addressed this about like the difference between studying, I guess, like European history and versus being immersed in Eastern European history,
Mhm.
I guess. What has been like your experience kind of looking at both of these things, or what kind of difference have you noticed, I guess, along those lines?
Well, for me, first of all, for historians, and this is different, this is a difference between historians and a lot of social scientists who work in broad comparative fields. To be a historian of a place, you have to learn the languages. You have to be able to read in the original languages, which is what makes it difficult to jump around, which
Mm.
is why historians tend to be more confined to their area. So like now, I mean, it's what's happening in Iran is absolutely fascinating, and I mean, these extraordinary women who are so brave, who are rising up, against this regime in Iran. And sometimes people are saying that you're doing so much for Ukraine. You're speaking about Ukraine. You're writing about Ukraine. You're defending these people. You're explaining these people. Why aren't you doing this for Syria? Why aren't you doing this for Iran? And the answer is I can't. I mean, I don't have the authority
Mm-hmm.
to comment in the same way about places where I haven't done the research and I don't know the languages and I don't have access in the original languages. And that's a huge difference. And it takes a long time to learn the languages, especially if you didn't grow up with them. So it's an investment that you can't so easily flit around.
Mm-hmm.
So I spent, a lot of my early adult life, learning, some of these East European languages. So I couldn't just, flit over to Portugal, and decide I'm going to write about Portugal, which is not to mean that like I don't care about Portugal or it's not important, but you're investing, in learning with a certain kind of depth.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing about becoming a Slavicist is, I became an East Europeanist in the 1990s when the archives were just opening.
Mm.
And that was so exciting. I mean, it was the Communist Party archives that had been, closed. It was behind lock and key for all these years. And suddenly communism falls and the archives start to open. So you could literally be the first person, to get in there and see documents as they were being declassified. And
Mm-hmm.
that was incredibly seductive. I mean, the voyeuristic thrill of being able to get to see things that nobody had been able to see before. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it was a thrilling time,
Mm-hmm.
to be, an aspiring historian running around Eastern Europe, because literally like things you couldn't get in 94, you would come back in 95 and maybe some of those documents had been declassified,
Mm.
and so you could keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And that was phenomenal. I mean, it was also very disturbing because the Communist Party archives, I describe them in my second book. It's a bit like how Freud describes the unconscious. So like a dark psychic closet in which
Uh-huh.
everything too disturbing for the conscious mind is shoved into that closet. And so what Freud understood is that, going through psychoanalysis is that you coax the contents of that closet into the light of day so that you can deal with them. But
Mm-hmm.
what Freud understood was that that was not going to be pleasant, and that
Mm-hmm.
was going to be deeply traumatic,
Mm-hmm.
because what was shoved inside that closet was generally not nice. And
Mm-hmm.
so the opening of the archives was also just wrenching,
Mm-hmm.
because things were shut up there behind lock and key, generally because they weren't very nice.
Yeah, there's like some reason it was all classified up until
Yeah.
then, for sure. That is that is like super interesting. I really think that your point about, really immersing yourself in this culture in order to like dissect kind of its history and be able to speak about it and like analyze is definitely very true. I think that, a lot of times in school we're kind of afraid to branch out of, beyond American history
Mhm.
for that very reason, in that our teachers maybe don't feel necessarily comfortable or qualified to
Mhm.
speak about other territories, or other countries, but that nonetheless is super, super important. And it's just up to, I guess, the next generation of historians, or to turn to like those sources of history to really understand, what's going on in these different countries and to learn more about them in a way as well.
Everybody should learn languages. That would be my message to your generation. And it's the older you get, the harder it is. You should
Yeah.
learn languages while you're young. You should travel. Well, I mean, I think the monolingualism of so much of America is a huge handicap of this country. And it's not just a linguistic handicap, it's a kind of imaginative handicap.
Mm-hmm.
If you grow up bilingual, then if you grow up being able to switch between two languages, then theoretically you can imagine a third or a fourth. But if
Mm-hmm.
the world has only ever existed to you in one language, the second is unimaginable.
Oh my
And I
God.
think for many Americans, like things that happen in
Mm-hmm.
languages other than English, we can't believe they're quite real. It's
Mm-hmm.
hard for us to imagine that those lives are quite real. And I think that's an imaginative leap that language enables us to make. You really only have a kind of meta understanding of code switching and of what language means once you know more than one. So it's one thing I would push your whole generation to do is learn languages, any languages. Just go somewhere, learn some language, and that will open up something to you. Now, obviously, life is short. We can't learn all the languages in the world, and language learning takes a long time, but you can pick one or two and learn
Mm-hmm.
them.
Wow, my mother would love you. She'd be like, "Come on, speak more Chinese."
Yes.
Like, this is pushing that home. Sure. Yeah. I guess I wanted to ask you about, I really like how you were talking about like this like lesson or this message that you impart to my generation. But I guess like what are some lessons that you feel like studying this European and Eastern European, and to be more specific, history, has provided you and has provided, you know, like the work that you do and has provided kind of your history community, I guess, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yes. Well, definitely there are things as a historian that journalists are always asking me, especially now that there's this war going on, what's
Mhm.
going to happen tomorrow? What's going to happen next week? What is Putin going to do? As a historian, you don't know what will happen.
Mhm.
Best case scenario, you understand what already happened, but you don't know what will happen. What you do have some understanding of is what can happen. And
Mhm.
there's a big difference between what will happen and what can happen. Like
Mhm.
Americans often tend to feel that the realm of the possible is much more circumscribed than
Mhm.
it actually is.
Mhm.
That certain things can't happen. And what history teaches us is that the thing that seems impossible, unimaginable, inconceivable can 3 months later become the new normal. And
Yeah.
people will have normalized the thing that was unimaginable unconsciously very quickly without even noticing. What Eastern European history, one of the things I deeply absorbed is that everything can look normal, but it can turn on a dime.
No.
Like that, the fragility of it all. I mean,
Mhm.
Czesław Miłosz says in one of his books that Americans don't understand that the habit of civilization is fragile.
Mm-hmm.
When Trump won the election in 2016, which I realize for your generation was already a very long time ago. For me, it feels like it was last week. Um, there was afterwards, I felt like, half of the people I knew were walking around saying, okay, this is bad. This is extremely bad, but it's going to be okay. We're going to get through it because we are the world's strongest liberal democracy. And we drink in our liberal democracy with our mother's milk, and we have checks and balances. And checks and balances became like a yoga mantra, like breathe in, checks and balances, breathe out, checks and balances. And I didn't know what would happen. But as a historian, I knew what could happen,
Mhm.
and I felt like, my God, we are like people on the Titanic saying our ship can't sink. We've got the best ship, we've got the newest ship, we've got the fanciest ship, our ship can't sink. And what history teaches you is that there is no such thing as a ship that can't sink,
Wow.
unfortunately.
Yeah, I think like this kind of brought up like this idea of that the only constant in life is the constant like capability to change, I guess, which
Mhm.
is on like a personal level super, super, reassuring. It's like, oh, you're not satisfied with who you are right now, you can change. But on a bigger worldwide scale with history, when we think of how much time has been used up or taken in order to build this idea of peace, it can definitely be like a super kind of like, oh my gosh, like no, don't like
Mhm.
don't do that to us right now for sure.
Things
Because
can turn really quickly.
yeah.
Unfortunately, like that fragility.
Hmm.
Um, it's and that's something I think East Europeans really did kind of drink in with their mother's milk. Even younger people, in a way that I feel like Americans are often in denial about, even though
Hmm.
horrible things happen in this country all the time, but we're still in denial about it. I
Hmm.
have friends, for instance, who are my generation from Serbia,
Hmm.
who were young, who were in their early 20s, I guess, late teens, early 20s in the 1990s, when the wars in Yugoslavia and the ethnic cleansings broke out.
Hmm.
And they got out, and they went to Austria, and they worked with refugees, and they did translation. And they're very happy, and they're assimilated into Austrian culture, and like they're generally very kind of chill, calm, people. They've got a great family, a nice apartment. But if you kind of scratch the surface, you see that they have this awareness that everything's great, but it could be that tomorrow you wake up and everyone you know has turned into a fascist, and then you must immediately be prepared to pack your kids in the car and flee right away, because sometimes that just happens. And they have that, and it doesn't make them gloomy, it doesn't even make them fatalistic, but they have that awareness that things can slip, that the borders can recede, and it can happen very quickly.
Hmm.
And that's something as a historian. I mean, and I mean, it can happen for better or for worse. I mean, now people keep saying that Putin's regime is not going to fall. It's not going to fall. If it were going to fall, it was going to fall. It would have already fallen. I'll look at all these horrible things are happening. And my historian sensibility tells me that it will seem absolutely impossible that that regime will fall until the
Until
moment it does. And then it will seem retrospectively to have been inevitable, which doesn't mean
yeah,
when it will, but that eventually they all do.
yeah. I think even with the COVID-19 pandemic, I kind of remember just very much hearing, oh, like, oh, we might go into lockdown for 3 weeks. I was like, oh, that's never gonna happen. But
Yeah.
I got all the headlines going, oh, this is
Mhm.
our new normal. This is what we have to recover from. And I feel like, yeah, I feel like as Americans, we also don't have that sense of not necessarily urgency, but that hyper awareness that this might happen to us on a great scale as well, because of our own history and our own experiences as well. So I think that is like super interesting for sure.
Mhm.
Yeah. I guess we've kind of hit a lot of really, really interesting points, and I want to be respectful of your time.
Mhm.
So, do you have any like last minute thoughts or anything you want to kind of bring about before we wrap up?
If I could, just be in my role of teacher for a moment, since I'm speaking to your generation.
Of
I mean,
course.
looking at this country and looking at what's happening in Russia, and
Mhm.
these young soldiers being sent who are horrifically torturing people and slaughtering people for no reason, who are just unthinkingly following orders, looking at what happened during the Trump administration, looking at the racism, in this country, looking at the violence in this country. Um, I the thing that I would say as a kind of Arendtian, and Hannah Arendt is one of these philosophers I've always been thinking with, that I started reading when I was young. I started reading her when I was 19, and she has always stayed with me, and she felt like the the biggest crime is the failure to think. There
Mhm.
is no substitute for learning to think. There's no substitute for education. There's no substitute for thinking for yourself. There's no substitute for thinking critically. There's no shortcut. There's no, I mean, the first thing I thought, like, after the Trump election, was that, like, all of us at the university should be reaching out to secondary schools. We should all be going into high schools. University is already too late. Like, you have to, like there needs to be better education, like from preschool on up. Like, everybody needs to be able to think critically. There's no shortcut to that.
Mhm.
There's no shortcut to that anywhere. We've never found any other kind of, panacea. My 10-year-old daughter, who is asking me recently, she's like, Mommy, how is this happening? Why are the Russians killing the Ukraine? Why? And I said, well, the thing about, the thing about historians is that we understand a lot about how racism works, how fascism works, how totalitarianism works. We've really learned a lot, over the past 100 years or so. But what we haven't done is, like, come up with, a magical solution to make it stop. And,
Mhm.
and my daughter, child of the pandemic, said, well, we need a vaccination against manipulation. Yeah. And I said, yes. Unfortunately, we don't have a vaccination, but the closest we have is education. The
Mhm.
best we have is thinking for yourselves. So if I have a plea, to your generation, it's to throw yourself into that. It's to really take responsibility, to take responsibility for reading critically, to take responsibility for thinking critically,
Mhm.
because the future really is in your hands. I know this is a cliche, but it really is in your hands, and there's just no substitute for that.
Mhm. I think that, like, the idea of a vaccination, oh my gosh, that is so relevant, but I also feel like education is definitely something that, I'm gonna walk away from this conversation throwing myself into Chinese, throwing myself into new
Oh,
languages
good.
and new experiences. Yeah, I think that is such a that's a very, very relevant message that I think a lot of people on a day-to-day basis don't really think of, going to school as being all that, like, oh my gosh, like, I'm changing the world, but in essence that is what education and what we are going out into the workforce and kind of doing as well. Just
Oh,
super cool.
I mean, writing history is about imaginatively projecting yourselves into times and places where you yourself were not.
Mhm,
It's an imaginative exercise of making an imaginative leap. Languages help us make that imaginative leap. Reading ourselves into novels help us make an imaginative leap. That
mhm,
capacity to imagine the world from different perspectives is the best vaccination we have. There's nothing magical, but that effort, to
mhm,
cultivating that effort is the best we have. So this is my plea to your
mhm.
generation and to everyone.
That's so great. Yeah. And with that, I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you again so much, Professor Shore, for this awesome conversation. I definitely learned so much from it as well.
Oh, you're very welcome. Good luck.
Yes. And to everyone watching at home, thank you so much, and I will see you next time.